In the late 19th century, a solitary figure wandered the freezing, blizzard-swept peaks of the Swiss Alps. He lived on the fringes of society, driven by a mind that would eventually dismantle the foundations of Western philosophy. This was Friedrich Nietzsche. At 24, he became a professor of classical philology at the University of Basel, an academic prodigy whose career was abruptly cut short. By his late 20s, he was crippled by severe physical ailments, blinding migraines, deteriorating eyesight, and a complete digestive collapse left him bedridden for days at a time. At 34, his body gave out, forcing him to resign his professorship. Nietzsche identified as a spiritual cultural warrior, a figure whose inner discipline and battle for a new culture defined him more than his failing health. In his own journals, he claimed he wasn't just a man, but dynamite. He elevated the body and the concept of health to the center of his philosophy, arguing that physiological vitality is the true arbiter of value. For Nietzsche, if a body was failing, the ideas it produced were merely symptoms of that decay, a diagnostic he would soon apply to all of Western civilization. Europe in the late 19th century was transforming rapidly. The rise of modern science, the spread of industrialization, and radical secular thought was systematically dismantling the old religious and moral frameworks that had organized human life for centuries. Observing this, Nietzsche issued his most famous declaration, "God is dead." Rather than a celebration, Nietzsche presented this as a terrifying cultural crisis. He warned that the loss of a moral North Star would leave the modern subject abandoned, wandering as if through an endless nothing. Without a transcendent compass to guide human action, Nietzsche argued that society faced two bleak outcomes: a collapse into suicidal despair, or a regression into a state of numbed mediocrity he called the last man. As this diagram illustrates, the last man is a herd-like creature, concerned only with modest comforts and the absolute avoidance of pain. This version of humanity is swallowed by the mass, trading individual greatness for mindless conformity. Modernity's sickness is exactly this loss of objective truth. It leaves a cultural vacuum that threatens to smother human potential entirely. To treat this cultural sickness, Nietzsche first had to adapt his own methods. Unable to sit and write long treatises due to his illness, he began composing in short, intense bursts of creative energy, known as aphorisms. He redefined health as resilience, arguing that true vitality requires the ability to harness suffering and forge it into greatness. From this perspective, he rejected herd morality as a survival mechanism for the weak. He argued traditional ethics functioned solely to demonize strength and glorify submission, keeping the collective safe. This animation shows his prescribed cure for the individual. To break free from the herd, he proposed the will to power. It moves beyond simple political dominance, describing a fundamental drive for self-mastery, redirected inward to shape the individual's own chaotic instincts. True power is an internal psychological engine. It is the human drive for radical self-mastery, artistic creativity, and continuous self-overcoming. The ultimate target of this rigorous internal discipline is the evolution into an exceptional figure Nietzsche called the Übermensch, or the Overman. Existing in a meaningless universe, the Übermensch creates their own meaning and values. They refuse to rely on the false comforts of religion or the illusion of objective truth. Achieving this requires passing a grueling psychological test. Nietzsche called it amor fati, the love of fate. Amor fati demands the absolute, joyful acceptance of existence, exactly as it is. You must embrace all horrific suffering and profound joy as essential. Faced with the death of God, Nietzsche's prescription is a demand for radical self-creation. He places the absolute burden of meaning squarely onto the shoulders of the individual. Just as his intellectual output reached its zenith in 1889, Nietzsche's mind completely and permanently collapsed. The breakdown occurred here, in the Piazza Carlo Alberto in Turin, Italy. Following this event, he remained a silent invalid for his final decade, entirely unaware of his growing fame. Control of his life and his vast archive of unpublished notes fell to his sister, Elisabeth Forster Nietzsche. Elisabeth was a virulent anti-Semite and a fierce German nationalist. These were two ideologies that Friedrich Nietzsche had openly despised and explicitly criticized in his own writings. Disregarding his actual views, Elisabeth maliciously edited his journals. She softened his harshest criticisms, stitched together fragmented notes out of context, and published a fabricated book under the title The Will to Power. Her selective editing was deliberate. She weaponized his philosophy to appeal to German militarism and, eventually, the rising Nazi movement. A philosophy meticulously built to champion supreme individualism was systematically mutated into a foundational myth for the most murderous herd mentality in modern history: fascism. For decades, this mutilated, fascistic version of Nietzsche was the only one the general public knew. It was not until the mid-20th century that rigorous scholars and depth psychologists bypassed his sister's edits to unearth his actual ideas. Sigmund Freud drew heavily from Nietzsche's early models of the unconscious mind, adopting his insights on repressed drives and self-deception to help build the foundation of psychoanalysis. Carl Jung engaged in a lifelong dialogue with Nietzsche's work, using it to understand the psychological shadow and the deep, complex process of integrating the self. By returning to the original, untampered texts, modern historical scholarship has definitively stripped away the fascist veneer.
In January 1889, on the snowy, cobblestone streets of Turin, Italy, a man collapsed. Witnesses saw him throw his arms around the neck of a carriage horse that was being beaten, weeping before losing consciousness. He never recovered his sanity. That single breakdown plunged him into a state of permanent dementia, abruptly leaving decades of explosive, unfinished writings entirely unprotected. The man on the street was Friedrich Nietzsche, a philosopher who spent his career systematically tearing down the moral and political dogmas of 19th century Europe. The death of his mind left thousands of pages of private notebooks, radical, unfinished, and deeply provocative, completely unguarded. Almost immediately, a new custodian seized absolute legal and physical control over his unpublished notebooks, his younger sister, Elisabeth Forster Nietzsche. Handing these manuscripts to Elisabeth carried a specific risk. She and her brother operated on opposite ends of the political spectrum.
Friedrich proudly called himself a good European. He championed radical individualism and openly detested the growing trends of German cultural chauvinism, nationalism, and anti-Semitism. Elisabeth, conversely, was a fierce German nationalist and a committed anti-Semite. She embodied the exact ideologies her brother spent his life ruthlessly mocking. The provocative, unfinished thoughts of a genius were now completely at the mercy of his ideological enemy. To understand the extremity of Elisabeth's motives, we have to look back to the 1880s, far from Europe, in the remote jungles of South America. Elisabeth and her husband, Bernhard Forster, traveled to Paraguay to establish Nueva Germania, a utopian colony designed to be purely Aryan and explicitly anti-Semitic. Friedrich reacted to this project with absolute fury, leading to a bitter and prolonged estrangement between the siblings. In his letters, he explicitly disavowed her actions. He wrote that he had to defend himself against people who confused him with her husband's party, stating, "These accursed anti-Semite deformities shall not sully my ideal." He applied this same standard to his inner circle, cutting deep personal ties with prominent cultural figures, like the composer Richard Wagner, over their embrace of similar nationalistic leanings. His fierce opposition to these movements was fully documented and central to his identity while he was still lucid. Back in Germany in the 1890s, Elisabeth, now a widow, established a formidable archive at the Villa Silberblick to control all access to her brother's legacy. Elisabeth utilized the curation process to align his legacy with her own political survival and high society ambitions. She suppressed the letters that proved his anti-Semitism, and she began aggressively stitching together his discarded, disconnected notebook fragments. This tampering culminated in a book framed as his ultimate masterpiece, The Will to Power. In reality, Friedrich had abandoned the project entirely. To be historically accurate, Friedrich did write harsh, elitist, and anti-democratic ideas. Elisabeth didn't have to invent those concepts. Her crime was stripping away his psychological context. She removed his focus on internal self-overcoming and manipulated his metaphors until they read as literal instructions. By doing so, she repackaged a highly inward philosophy of individual mastery into a literal, aggressive blueprint for national dominance. Fast forward to the 1930s. Elizabeth's doctored, weaponized version of her brother's philosophy had seeped into mainstream political ideology. The ultimate consequence of her lifelong curation arrived when the leader of the Third Reich personally visited the archive to pay homage. Top Nazi propagandists like Joseph Goebbels actively mined her version of the will to power for quotes, using them to publicly justify the regime's inhumane policies. Elizabeth died a hero to the Nazi Party, having successfully cemented her brother as their intellectual godfather. The very man who despised German nationalism had been posthumously sculpted into its most revered and destructive prophet. The turning point did not arrive until after World War II, when independent scholars finally gained access to the untampered archives. A massive scholarly effort began to expose the Elizabeth conspiracy, meticulously separating the philosopher's true voice from the propagandist's edits. Friedrich Nietzsche once wrote that there are no facts, only interpretations. Tragically, his own legacy proved his point. The Nazi Nietzsche was a deliberate historical fabrication. The survival of his actual ideas proves that true intellectual rigor demands looking past the curator to confront the unfiltered source material itself. Long before modern psychology mapped the human mind, the idea that we are creatures driven by hidden desires and deep anxieties was born outside the clinic. It erupted in the explosive writings of a 19th-century philosopher. At the time, the prevailing Enlightenment view held a very flattering picture of humanity. We were considered inherently rational, moral beings, fully in control of our actions and guided by cool logic. Friedrich Nietzsche dismantled that flattering picture entirely. He argued that our celebrated moral posturing is actually dictated by raw, primal physiological drives operating far below the surface of our awareness. Knowing his contemporaries were not ready for this reality, he claimed he wrote for ears that did not yet exist. By exposing these hidden mechanisms, he created the philosophical diagnostic tool that would eventually birth 20th-century psychoanalysis. Sigmund Freud would later formalize these hidden depths, creating a clinical map to navigate the human psyche. Looking closely at Freud's architecture, we find direct translations of Nietzsche's concepts. Freud's chaotic id mirrors Nietzsche's wild Dionysian energy. The rational ego acts as the structured Apollonian force, and the punishing superego operates exactly like Nietzsche's concept of bad conscience. Carl Jung took this framework and expanded it. He looked beyond the individual patient, applying this dynamic to the collective consciousness of entire societies. Jung argued that Nietzsche's Dionysian force, the untamed instinct of humanity, was what he called the shadow. It was a vital energy that modern civilization was actively trying to suppress. Jung observed that because Europe had spent centuries denying and repressing the shadow, the energy didn't just vanish, it metastasized. It erupted on a mass scale, taking the shape of 20th-century fascism. The continent's failure to integrate those darker Dionysian instincts turned into a waking nightmare. It proved a core Nietzschean warning. Denying our deepest, most irrational drives paves the way for our destruction. In the aftermath of the Second World War, the physical devastation of Europe mirrored a deeper moral collapse. It was the literal, smoking manifestation of Nietzsche's declaration that God is dead. Into this intellectual and spiritual vacuum stepped a new wave of thinkers, gathering in the cafes of a recently liberated Paris. Philosophers like Jean-Paul Sartre and his contemporaries set out to build a framework for navigating a world stripped of its traditional certainties. Simone de Beauvoir and Sartre adopted a premise deeply rooted in Nietzsche's thought: existence precedes essence. They argued that humans are not static objects stamped with a predestined purpose. Without a divine creator assigning us a role, human nature is no longer a biological or spiritual destiny. It becomes an open-ended project, something we are burdened with defining for ourselves. This required a new standard for living, one Nietzsche had already outlined with his concept of the Übermensch, or Superman. Stripped of later political distortions, the Übermensch represents the ultimate psychological standard of authenticity, the courage to create and take total ownership of your own personal values, standing entirely alone in a universe that offers no inherent meaning. The alternative is what existentialists called inauthenticity. Faced with the paralyzing anxiety of absolute free choice, the easiest path is to surrender to the herd mentality, letting society make the decisions for you. The philosopher Martin Heidegger provides the ultimate cautionary tale. Despite his brilliant work on the nature of being, he actively joined the National Socialist Party in the 1930s, trading difficult intellectual freedom for the comfortable, destructive belonging of the Nazi herd. Authenticity demands that we bravely face the abyss of individual choice. Seeking comfort by dissolving into a collective ideology is the fastest, most certain path to moral collapse. Nietzsche's destructive project did not stop at the human mind or the soul. He eventually turned his hammer on language itself, attacking the concept of absolute truth. This led to a fascinating paradox in his legacy. Despite leaving behind a trail of notoriously misogynistic remarks in his published works, his philosophy became a foundational tool for modern feminist theory. In the late 20th century, French post-structuralist thinkers like Luce Irigaray and Sarah Kaufmann began to read his texts through a radically different lens. They realized that in Nietzsche's writing, woman does not function as a literal gender. Instead, it operates as a subversive metaphor, a literary device used to evade rigid definitions. They recognized this metaphor as a tool of alterity. It is a disruptive force designed specifically to dismantle dogmatic truths imposed by traditional patriarchal authority. Irigaray and Kaufmann applied these tools to successfully break down the rigid binary systems of Western philosophy, showing how fluid and context-dependent our concepts of identity actually are. This elegant intellectual hijack stands in stark contrast to the actions of Nietzsche's sister, Elisabeth Forster Nietzsche. While Elisabeth literally cut and pasted his unpublished notes to crudely force them into the mold of German nationalism, the 20th century thinkers achieved genuine intellectual liberation by understanding how his philosophy actually functioned. These three movements, integrating the psychological shadow, accepting existential freedom, and challenging absolute truth, provide the toolkit for navigating the modern condition,